Thank you very much, Brad. There's been some challenging numbers and thoughts there. And what I'd like to do is open up to the floor now for questions and let Brad comment on some of those things. We've got 15, 20 minutes. We can go through that, and then we'll wrap up the formal part of our session here right now. So I'll throw it open to the floor and let Brad take your questions one at a time. Thank you. Right. Sure.
Um, that's a great question. How do you get corporate Canada in the bedroom alive in the right kind of way? Well, as you know from that report, one of the things that we found in the report, or I should say three things that we found in the report, was that what happens outside of the bedroom is very important for predicting sexual satisfaction in marriage. So fostering more commitment, fostering date nights, fostering communication, fostering even in the case of the States, a bit more domestic equality with guys helping out more in the household. All these things are linked to more satisfying sexual relationships for married parents in the U.S. Um, so these are some of the kinds of things that are not as controversial directly that have implications though for sexual satisfaction. These are the kinds of things that could be embodied in advertising campaigns, for instance, like pushing like the value of a date night, for instance, couples that might be helpful. Um, Beyond that, I've not thought a lot about how companies could foster, or even um, could foster high levels of sexual satisfaction. But I should say too, once again, that even on this question of sexual satisfaction, that we know that couples, generally speaking, particularly in the emotional department, are more satisfied in their relationships when they're in married, faithful relationships compared to cohabiting relationships, compared to dating relationships, especially compared to ones where they're engaged in multiple current partnerships. So the point there simply is that even in sort of this question of sexual satisfaction, it's still the case that sort of promoting ethic of marital monogamy is also good on average for adults. Well, I think that that concern about the impact of kids on the environment is certainly a salient one for some people. But I have to say, at least looking at the data in the States, I think it's more of an elite concern than it is a kind of mass concern because we've actually seen an uptick in kind of the ideal family size in the U.S. to about 2.6. So people are having right now about 2 kids per month on average in the U.S. But if you ask them what kind of their ideal family size, it's about 2.6 kids, and it's slightly up since the 1970s. Kind of that concern about the impact of kids on the environment has not kind of filtered its way down into at least people's ideals when it comes to family size. Right. Well, yeah, that's correct. So we have on pages 2 and 3 of the report different demographic pyramids for China and for India in 2030 to give you a sense of kind of where they're headed. You can see that India is still headed for some substantial growth after 2030, whereas China is headed for at least based on the population pyramid, some declines in population. Um, Frankly, I would say that the U.S. is a bit closer to India and Canada is a bit closer to China. Um, But what sort of the key kind of modifier there for Canada is that you have received a pretty large inflow of immigrants in recent years, And if that inflow continues, that will kind of mitigate the effects of having a below replacement fertility rate of about 1.7 in Canada, for many years now. So, but the question too becomes, Canada, I think, is that a lot of immigration has come from Asia, and given at least the trends in East Asia, some of that push may, from East Asia into Canada, this immigration may be coming down as the population of adults, places like China and South Korea, and Japan, Taiwan, shrinks because they've had such low fertility rates now for about 20 years or so. Sure. Well, I think on the one hand, there is a recognition that demographics pose a serious challenge to many countries, places like Italy, for instance. But there's also obviously a sense of limitation, real fiscal limits that they're now running up against, in part because of the demographic shifts that we're now running into. So on the one hand, I think there's a desire to create a context, and for at least some entities, that is more family friendly. But there's also a question about where the money's going to come from to help, pay for these kinds of programs. So it's so we have, for instance, a discussion about in page 21 about a generous Finnish home care allowance, which allows parents to use money from the state to place their child in daycare or to raise their child at home or place their child in the care of a grandparent. And it would work out to, I think, around $2,000 at least in U.S. money per child. Now, this kind of thing is harder to sort of make a case for in many countries, given their own fiscal constraints. But so it's a kind of question of how much can you spend on these challenge cases. So this is what I've encountered. Well, that's a great question. So what can companies do internally? I think part of it, we've seen, for instance, in studies from IBM. Now, not every company has this ability, but IBM has been pushing a lot of flexibility in terms of scheduling with their employees and allowing employees to do a lot of work, from the home when possible. And they've actually saved a lot of money in office space because they've got less folks working in formal offices and more working in home, or I think it's something in Starbucks. And what they've also seen in looking at the effects of this on the families of IBM employees is that their sort of work-life tension has decreased and the family life satisfaction has increased. So one thing that I think can be done for certain kinds of jobs and certain kinds of companies is to foster a more flexible working environment. It allows people to set their own hours and work in their own environment, as long as they're maintaining a certain level of productivity for the company. Of course, it doesn't work for every industry. If you're manufacturing, for instance, automobile, you can't have people doing that at home. But it is an option, I think, for some companies that can be intentional about doing that. But it's also the case, too, that there are things that companies can do, like provide some level of relationship skills training that will be applicable to employees across the spectrum, be they married, collaborating, and whatnot, that will redound to the benefit of families. And also things, too, like, for instance, help with budgeting and with finances. That couples who have received a good, basic training in budgeting tend to do better as a couple, of course, also on the financial front as well. So some things like that, I think, at the margins where companies may not be able directly to target married couples, but they can provide services that will be helpful to married couples in ways that would be helpful to the quality of their married lives and support.
Of course.
Yeah, right, sure. That's a great question. Actually, I don't know the nature of divorce law here in Canada, but I do know that in the United States, we have seen that young adults who have seen their own parents get divorced are more likely to cohabit and they're more likely to get married, in the second place, because they're fearful both of kind of the emotional and the financial consequences of divorce. So there's a kind of way in which the long arm of divorce, um, really throughout the West, seems to be a pretty marked increase in cohabitation. And that's indicative in part of the fact that couples have a more their faith in marriage has been undercut by the divorce of their own parents or their uncle and aunt or their friends. And they think that by cohabiting, they can kind of hedge their bets a bit. Um, so I think that's part of the story here. Um, and one response I think that some states in the U.S. are beginning to consider is to draft divorce legislation that would take into account a bit more people's investments in the marriage, and take those into account when it comes to um, allocating property in the wake of a divorce, in part for reasons of justice, but also in part to send a signal to people that the investments they make in their marriage are to be respected. The idea is that we might, in some ways, then foster greater faith in marriage than we currently do. Is that what you're getting at, or something else? Well, it is the case that young adults in the U.S. who have seen their parents get divorced are more likely to not get married, and they're more likely to cohabit and have kids in a cohabiting relationship. So that certainly is pretty clear in the evidence. Is there some other specific question though you want me to address in terms of the science beyond that fact? Yeah, the impact. If you email me, I can, or through Dave, I can give you a sort of figure from the site. Right, right. Sure. Certainly in Quebec, I think that probably be the case to a certain degree. It's certainly the case in Sweden to a large degree right now, and it's certainly the case in more working class or poor communities in the U.S. But we often see is that people they'll have their kids in their 20s with someone or some people, and then they will get married to someone else entirely in their 30s after they've all settled down, and they feel like they're mature enough and they've got enough financial stability in their 30s to go ahead at that point in their view and get married. But the point that I think both are getting at in part here too is that in the mind of the public at large, to a great extent, marriage has become a kind of a soulmate model. It's about finding your best friend, that person you really connect with, and also having a certain degree of financial stability beneath you as a couple. And it's not seen in the mind of the public as that closely connected to being a parent with someone. And so kind of our understanding of marriage has become focused on the dyad rather than sort of seeing it as part and parcel of a number of goods, including romance, but also children, mutual aid, economic cooperation. Yes, ma'am. Right. Right. Sure. Well, we know that cohabitation in the States is becoming less stable, and so and also people are cycling through more partners over the course of their life. We don't have kind of like the latest number on what that amounts to, but the sort of the trajectory is towards less stability and more partners. And what's interesting too is that in Sweden, it's kind of held up as a kind of, well, Quebec, if you will, Northern Europe, where cohabitation has a lot of status, both legally and culturally. Even in Sweden, cohabitation is a less stable relationship than is marriage. So kids who are born to a cohabiting couple in Sweden are about 75% more likely to see their parents break up by the time they turn 12 compared to kids who are born to married couples in Sweden. And I haven't seen data on Quebec, but I suspect it would be a similar story where even in Quebec, there's less stability there for kids and couples than there is for kids and couples who are doing it through marriage route. Well, that's a great question. So the question is, are there countries that have been able to kind of pull out of this low fertility scenario? And even the U.S. actually would be an example in some ways of that, because in the 70s we had a TFR of about 1.7. Now we're back to about 2.0 right now. So I don't think it's the case that any trend, be it fertility or marriage, is necessarily going to travel in one direction, indefinitely. And I think it depends both on the political process, the economic scene, the culture, sort of push things in one way or another. And that's of course what we're all about, is trying to push these kinds of trends in the right direction. We haven't had a great deal of success, frankly, in Europe and the Americas. But one of the points to the report is to suggest that as we become cognizant, for instance, the fact that the welfare state does tend to depend upon, um, generally speaking, some growth in the working age population to kind of give us more taxpayers to pay into that system. If that ceases to happen, it can, I think, create potentially an intellectual crisis for proponents of, um, in this case, of small families, because they're clearly not sustainable, that model, when it comes to keeping welfare state funds, which they tend to be pretty keen on in other respects. So my point simply is that these new challenges that are facing us, both socially and economically, may give us an opportunity to say, well, look, this contemporary family model doesn't serve our economy very well, doesn't serve the state very well. Maybe we need to rethink our approach to the family in ways that are more consistent with, I wouldn't call it a traditional model, but might call it kind of a natural model of one that welcomes kids and sees marriage as important and good for them. Well, that's a tough question here. It's yeah, yeah. Um, well, that's a tough question. I think we haven't seen that, and we're not likely to see that. I think yet in Europe, most of Europe and the Americas. Where it has actually emerged, though, is in Russia, where they've had such problems with fertility and mortality. Russia is one of those countries where they're seeing a real decline in population size, every year. Same thing's true in Japan. Um, and pretty dramatic declines too. And so they're looking, basically all policy options are on, you know, on the table there in Russia because of what's happening there. And so they have begun to revisit their abortion laws in Russia with a view in part to try to bring the Russian fertility rates back closer to replacement. So, and this goes back to this question for the gentleman over here, that sometimes these demographic realities can be so powerful that they begin to challenge the kind of conventional wisdom about how we should structure our law and our political system. So Russia is one case today that suggests that if things go so low when it comes to fertility and it comes, in this case, so high when it comes to mortality, that that these demographic shifts can be so dramatic that countries are beginning to rethink their approach to family.
Brad, we will token of our thanks for quite of our technical difficulties. We tested it this afternoon. We ran through it just as we got here, and the moment we wanted to use it, some glitches. I guess that's just set to tempt us here a little bit. My thanks to Brad for joining us today. My thanks to you for bringing this information forward. A couple of announcements and things just as we're wrapping up here. If you don't receive our biweekly e-reviews, which is something we put together, it's about 700-800 word op-ed size that looks at current research. We sometimes do current book reviews on these types of topics. If you're not receiving that and would like to, at the registration desk is a little form. You just fill out your name, address, and email, and we'd be only too pleased to add you to our mailing list. Or, of course, you can do it online at imfcanada.org. And with that, it's a little segue in that we are currently redoing our websites. Everybody has to redo their website once in a while, right? So we've had ours going for about 5-6 years, and so we're updating that right now, and we're hoping to have it launched within about the next 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. Give us a little bit of time just to move all the data from the old site over to the new site, and the bells and whistles should work accordingly. Talking about website, I just want to come back to your question as well about love, marriage, baby carriage, or which order those actually come in. Our last conference, which was held May of 2011, Dr. Mark Rigneris from the University of Texas was up, a colleague of Dr. Wilcox, and he spoke somewhat around that issue as well. You may want to go online, and for anybody to go online just to see that, to see what his analysis of that was in terms of what young couples are missing out on if they go through that process in a different order, advantages, disadvantages, and so on. So I would encourage you to go and try that. We'd like to have your feedback, and what we're going to do today, because I know if I give you a piece of paper, it's going to end up on the floor, and I got to clean it up and all that sort of stuff. So tomorrow in your inbox, you're going to get a short, really short little link, and it's simple. I think there's 5 or 6 questions. Peter John's nodding yes, so it's 5 or 6 questions. Little thing you just click off, and we'll get that information. It really does help us. We need to know what we can do better, how we can improve for our next policy session as well. And so that's really important. If you just take a minute to do that, we would appreciate it. If you have any additional questions for Dr. Wilcox, we're going to be here for about another half an hour. And so if your question didn't come up, or you just want to ask a question sort of more one-on-one, please take advantage of that. He'll be here. He doesn't get out of here till I buy dinner, so it works out well all the way around. Some people have asked about the next Institute of Marriage and Family Conference, which we usually have in March. We're trying something different this year. In past years, we've run it usually on a Thursday, just before the Manning Networking Conference. This year, what we decided to do is we're not going to hold our conference. We're going to have more sessions like this throughout the year, but we're also sponsoring a keynote speaker at the Manning Convention. And this year, I'm pleased to announce for the first time publicly that we're bringing Dr. Marvin Olasky up from the University of Texas, and he will be speaking at the keynote luncheon on the Friday. And we're very pleased to bring him up. So if you follow World Magazine or some of his other writings in the past, you'll enjoy his time with us at that particular point as well. He is currently the editor-in-chief of World Magazine. He's a holder of Distinguished Chair in Journalism and Public Policy at Patrick Henry College, author of 18 books, co-author of another 10, numerous articles. Philanthropy magazine called Dr. Olasky's Tragedy of American Compassion, one of the 8 books that changed America. He's been translated into a multitude of different languages. He's got a commonality at Yale. He did his undergrad at Yale as well. And he is married for 35 years, 4 sons, PTA president, bicyclist, and a host of other things as well. So I'd invite you to attend that. Registration is, you can get the link from our website, imfcanada.org, and link through to the registration page for the Manning Convention as well. Early bird cutoff is February 15th, so if you want to get the early bird rates, please do register before that time as well. That's going to wrap it up formally from my end. Again, my thanks to Dr. Wilcox. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming out today on a busy afternoon when you probably have to be out golfing. Oh, it's snow still on the ground, isn't it? Just you feel that warm air. It just feels good. So again, thank you very much. We're going to close off the formal time, but again, you don't have to rush away for the next half hour or so. So thank you very much for joining us, and one last thank you for Dr. Wilcox.